Somewhere in the middle of Avatar, The Last Airbender, there's a scene where Iroh takes time out of hunting the most wanted child on the planet to go and buy a new Paisho tile. Zuko is livid. They are fugitives, and his uncle is at a dodgy merchant's pier, haggling over a small black disc about 1.5 inches across with a white flower painted on it. Zuko thinks the old man has finally lost the plot. Zuko is wrong. Iroh is replacing his ID card for a global intelligence network that predates every government on the map. That tile is where we're starting tonight, because that tile is the whole thing. 3,000 years of quiet meddling, one very public afternoon in Ba Sing Se, and then the worst breakup in the history of secret societies. So this is the story of the White Lotus, and it's also the story of the Red Lotus, and the slightly awkward part is that those are the same story. The villains in the back half of this video used to sit at the same table. Anyway, let's talk about the game first. Paisho is a board game, and I want to be honest about how little the show tells us about it, because the answer is almost nothing. We see the board. We see people slapping tiles down with real conviction. We see Iroh describe it as more than just a game, which is the sort of thing that sounds wise until you realise he says it about roughly everything. What we do know is this: the board is a grid, a big one, and it's split into gardens and gates. There are 4 gates, one on each side, in red and white. The rest of the board is divided into red gardens, white gardens, and neutral ground. Your tiles are flowers mostly. Basic flowers come in red and white, and there are special tiles on top of that. The point of the game, roughly, is to get your flowers into harmony with each other, lining them up in clean, uninterrupted lines while stopping your opponent doing the same. A red flower, sitting in a red space harmonising with a white flower in a white space, is worth extra. There's a lovely bit of logic in that, actually. The game rewards you for putting things where they belong. And then there's the White Lotus. Here's the thing I love about the White Lotus tile. It isn't a basic white flower. It's a special tile, and it sits in its own category. And mechanically, it's a bit of an odd one out. Iroh says outright that most players underestimate it, which is a very Iroh way of telling you something enormous while appearing to comment on a hobby. Because the tile is not really a tile, it's a handshake. The Order of the White Lotus takes its name from that piece, and the way you tell another member you're a member is that you play. You don't say anything. You don't flash a ring or roll up a sleeve. You sit down opposite a stranger, and you put the lotus in the middle of the board, and then you place your other tiles around it in a very specific pattern, quickly, until the whole thing forms a lotus bud opening up with the lotus chip at the centre. If the other person knows what they're looking at, they know exactly who you are. If they don't, they've just watched a bloke play a slightly strange opening. We see it happen in the desert. Iroh sits down with a man called Fung, plays the lotus, and Fung says the line about the lotus tile not having much use these days, which is the scripted half of the code. Iroh disagrees, the pattern goes down, and suddenly Fung is producing forged passports and a plan for getting 2 of the most hunted people in the Earth Kingdom into Ba Sing Se. That's the whole apparatus. A game. Now, if you want the version of this that gets properly silly, you have to go to the Yang Chen novels because they actually give you the sequence, and it is long. In Yang Chen's era, the recognition ran: Jasmine 1-7, Rose 2-6, White Lily 3-6, Chrysanthemum 4-6, White Jade 5-6, Rhododendron 6-6, Dragon 2-5, Knotweed 5-2. Then you mirror that whole run on the opposite side of a line drawn from the 0-0 corner to the 6-6. Then you do both of those things again for the other 3 quadrants of the board, and then you finish on the appropriate tile in the element cycle. Read that back. That is not a handshake, that is a full recital. That is a password with 4 verses. I genuinely don't know how long that takes to place, but it isn't seconds, and the entire time you're doing it, you're just 2 people playing a board game in public, with nobody able to prove a thing, which is, when you sit with it, an absolutely brilliant bit of tradecraft. Think about what a secret society actually needs. It needs a way for two members who have never met, in two different nations, possibly on opposite sides of a war, to verify each other without producing a single piece of physical evidence. No documents to be found. No phrase that sounds like anything if you overhear it. No object that means anything if it's confiscated, because the object is a game piece that thousands of people own. You could search Iro top to bottom and find a pie show tile in his pocket and think, old man likes his board game, and you would be completely correct. And also, you would have just failed to identify the head of an international intelligence service. The game is the network. That's the part I keep coming back to. It's not that the Order uses pie show as a signal, it's that the Order grew out of pie show. It started as a club where masters of various arts came to challenge each other across a board. Proper masters from everywhere, with nothing in common except being extraordinarily good at something and enjoying a game. And the fixture list slowly became a network. And the network slowly became something with opinions about how the world should be run, which is not historically an unusual way for these things to happen. Clubs turn into institutions when the members start being useful to each other. It just happens that these particular members could bend lava and level fortresses. There's also a lovely detail about strategy in all this. The White Lotus tile is described as a key element in the Order's strategy, and I've always liked the double meaning. Strategy in the game, obviously, but also the tile as a strategy, the whole doctrine of the Order compressed into an object. A small thing that most people ignore, which is quietly load-bearing. There's an argument the show's making here that you don't really clock until later, which is that Iroh's line about it being more than just a game is not a metaphor. He isn't being profound, he's being literal, and he's telling on himself, and Zuko is too busy being furious to notice. That's the joke. It's a good joke. One thing that always fascinated me about the Order's relationship with the game is what they do about prizes. Because there's a problem here, right? Old men, board game, competitive streaks, absolutely no supervision. That's a gambling den. That is exactly how you get a group of the wisest people alive losing their houses to each other. The Order does not gamble, it's a rule. Instead, and I promise this is real, it's in the cookbook, the prize for pie show is a special cookie. The cookie of the White Lotus. And the winner gets first pick of the cookies. Everyone gets a cookie in the end. I'm sorry, that's perfect. That is the funniest possible piece of world building for this organisation, and it's tucked away in a recipe book. The most sophisticated covert network on the planet, the people who will one day take back the largest city in the world. And their tournament structure is, winner chooses first, nobody goes home empty-handed. It tells you more about the White Lotus than 3 episodes of exposition. They're competitive, and they're deeply, almost annoyingly, fair. The whole philosophy is in the biscuit tin. There's one more pie show moment that I think about a lot, and it's tiny, and it's right at the start of everything. Aang plays pie show with Monk Gyatso, back before any of it. 2 air nomads at a board. And it's a nice scene, and it's about a boy, and the man who raised him. And during the game, Gyatso tries to inconspicuously switch the Lotus tile with the piece Aang had just played. He's cheating. That's what that is. The gentlest man in the franchise is having a little fiddle with the board while a child isn't looking, and specifically, he's messing about with the White Lotus. Now, I've seen people read enormous significance into that. Gyatso was White Lotus. It's a signal. It's a hint. And it might be. There's no confirmation either way, and I'm not going to pretend there is. But I'll say the thing that's true regardless, which is that the writers put the Lotus tile in Aang's hands, in his first happy memory, years before anyone knew what it meant, and then never mentioned it again. Either that's foreshadowing, or it's a coincidence with extraordinarily good timing. Pretty wild either way. The small tragedy of Pie Show is that we've never actually been given the rules, not properly. The show plays fast and loose. Sometimes the tiles are in the squares, Sometimes they're on the intersections where the lines cross, and it changes depending on who's drawing the episode. Early fans, working from what they could see, settled on playing the intersections. The legend of Korra tightened it up a bit and leaned towards the boxes, so there are now competing reconstructions, and people have built whole rule sets and there are tournaments, and I find this completely delightful. A game invented as set dressing that fans then reverse engineered into an actual playable thing. There's a whole video in that on its own, and I've got it on the list. But for tonight, the useful bit is small, and it's this. Before the Order was an army, before it was a scandal, before any of the trouble we're going to get into later, it was a club with a board and a rule about biscuits. Everything that follows grows out of that. The good bits and the bad bits both. Now let's talk about how a club with a biscuit rule ended up watching avatars from the back of the room for the next few millennia. The Order of the White Lotus was supposed to stay small. That's the founding intention stated plainly. A small secret society of like-minded individuals, and no more than that. Scholars from all over the world, masters of various arts, meeting to challenge each other. That's the brief. That's the whole brief. It did not stay small. And the way the wiki puts it is that as it grew in numbers and influence, the Order became ever more sophisticated, which is a wonderfully neutral sentence for a fairly dramatic process. It transcended being a mere club. It assumed responsibility for sharing knowledge around the world. And then eventually, its members began to influence avatars, becoming their teachers, becoming their protectors, steering them towards working for the good of all mankind. Nobody voted for this. That's the bit I'd like to sit with for a second. There's no charter, nobody elected them. A group of very clever people looked at the most powerful individual on the planet, decided that person needed guidance, and appointed themselves. And because they were right about roughly 90% of the time, nobody ever really made them stop. I don't think they ever noticed it happening, which is the honest reading. Nobody sat down one afternoon and voted to become a shadow government. It's just that when you put the cleverest people in the world in a room together, on a regular schedule for a few centuries, they will eventually start having opinions about what's outside the room. And then somebody with an opinion has a nephew in a ministry. And then somebody else knows a general. And the fixture list has quietly become a lever. That's how every institution like this happens, I think. Not a plot, a drift, a club that kept turning up, but they were disciplined about it. And this is the part I think gets flattened in most retellings. The Order didn't run the Avatar. Their doctrine was that their path should only directly intertwine with the Avatars during moments of generational import. The big ones, the hinges, and the rest of the time, they watched from afar and influenced the world in a much more subtle manner, which is a very polite way of saying they had a policy of not getting involved. Sort of like how a certain kind of parent tells you they're not going to interfere with your decisions, and then you find out they've been having a quiet word with everyone you work with for about a decade. So what does that actually look like on the ground? Because influence the world subtly is the sort of phrase that means nothing until you see an example. And the Yang Chen novels give us a very good one. Avatar Yang Chen was an air nomad, and she grew up at the Western Air Temple, and the Order had members inside it. Not near it, inside it. Which means that from the moment she was identified, there were people in her home reporting on her. What they reported was strange. Yang Chen had an unusually strong connection to her past lives, so strong that she struggled to separate the past from the present. Memories of other people's decades bleeding into her own afternoon. High-ranking members of the Order learned about this early, through their contact at the temple, and filed it away. Then Yang Chen grew up and became a fully realised avatar and started, doing things. And the Order watched. They learned of the aftermath of her mission to Tianhaishi and the evacuation of the city, and they formed an opinion of her, which is where this gets uncomfortable. They thought she was an amateur. Their assessment And I want to give this in full because it's brutal. Too active. Did too many things herself on an operation, expected results too quickly, and had no ability to wait. That's their read on one of the most respected avatars in the entire cycle. A woman who is remembered by the air nomads as basically a saint. And the orders file on her says, impatient hands-on, doesn't understand the long game. Now here's my problem with that. They're not entirely wrong. That's the annoying bit. Yang Chen does do too much herself. She is impatient. But there's something a bit rich about a society of scholars who have spent centuries deciding that the correct move is almost always to wait, marking down someone for actually turning up. The order also kept an eye on money, which surprised me the first time I read it. After the Platinum affair, a new class of merchants called the Shang rose to real power, and the White Lotus watched them carefully. And the way they watched them is my favourite thing in this whole section. There was a very high-ranking Lotus called Ayunarak, alias Mama, and she lived in the Shang city of Bina, and she provided free meals to the unemployed. Read that again with the right eyes. That's not charity, or rather, it is charity, it's genuinely charity, and it's also the single best listening post you could possibly build. Every person who's just been laid off by the Shangs comes to you. Every rumour about who's hiring, who's cutting, what's being built where, and what nobody's supposed to know. It arrives at your table 3 times a day, voluntarily, and it costs you soup. I don't know whether to be impressed or slightly disturbed. Both, I think. Both is right. And then Yang Chen walks into the middle of it, and the whole thing goes sideways, and this is the moment I'd point to if someone asked me what the White Lotus actually is. Yang Chen turns up at Port Tugak. She's dealing with a group of people trying to grab her, and she needs somewhere to stash some unconscious bodies. And she notices something about the karmat there, the shelters. She recognises them. Specifically, she recognises them as maintained by the Order, which she should have no way of knowing. That's not knowledge she has, except one avatar before her had worked closely with the White Lotus and had been given their recognition codes. And Yang Chen's connection to her past lives is so strong that she can just reach back and pull it out. So she walks into a Kayamak and she recites the passphrases and she runs the pie show sequence, the whole thing, perfectly. Every quadrant in front of a low-ranking Lotus who is now having the worst day of his professional life. That man's entire job is that nobody outside the Order can do that, and a stranger has just done it flawlessly. They put the bodies away for her. She has a nap, and when she wakes up, a Yunarak is there with a bowl of stew. Mama knows immediately that the codes weren't given to Yang Chen. She can work it out. And when Yang Chen proposes an information trade, a Yunarak makes her feelings very clear. She's got no patience for the Avatar using manipulation and intrigue when the Order's whole thing is illuminating people with the truth. And in the middle of saying so, she lets something slip. She lets it slip that the Order knows about Yang Chen's gift. Yang Chen catches it instantly. Because if they know about the memories, they've known for years. And if they've known for years, they knew when she was a child. And if they knew when she was a child, then somebody was in her home. She is furious, genuinely, properly furious. Ayunarak apologizes. And then they get on with it, because there's a job on. But that's the moment where the Order stops being cute. Up to that point, you can tell yourself, this is a nice organisation of thoughtful old people who like flowers and cookies and truth. And then you get the actual shape of it. They were in a child's home, taking notes on the inside of her head and filing it upward. And they were still filing it decades later when she was the most powerful person alive. For an organisation whose creed is the quest for truth above all else, they are extremely comfortable not telling anyone anything. The rest of that Port Tugak business is a good example of the other thing though, which is that they're often just a step behind. Yang Chen tells Ayunarak everything she knows about the Unanimity Project, which is much more than the White Lotus had, and the two of them go and investigate the island together. Yang Chen clears the snow with the Avatar state, and they work out that the strange depressions in the ground are a target range. Something has been firing at this island, and no weapon they know of, and no regular bending either, could have done that kind of damage. Then they go their separate ways because Yang Chen concludes she's had the location wrong. That's the pattern. The Order has the reach, the assets, the centuries of paperwork, and Yang Chen has the actual answers, and the two of them keep passing each other in corridors. For all the infrastructure, for all the free soup and the coded shelters, they were several steps behind an impatient amateur. Ayunarak's last move in that story is my favourite mind. After the whole unanimity business is finished, she goes back to Benair and quietly disposes of a thin claw who's trying to grab a young man called Kavik, and she tells him, more or less, that his involvement is about to come to light, and it's high time he joined her and her friends. Recruitment. She saved his life and pitched him in the same breath. That's the job. That has always been the job. But there's a version of this story where all that watching goes badly wrong. And it did. And it went wrong at the single worst possible moment. Let's talk about Kyoshi. Avatar Kuruk died young. And when an avatar dies, there's a job that has to happen. And by that point in history, the job belonged to the White Lotus. Find the next one. That's it. That's the task. The world has just produced exactly one person with the reincarnated spirit of the planet in them. And somewhere out there is a child who doesn't know. And your entire organisation exists to find that child. They got it wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not late by a season. They identified the wrong person, and the actual avatar, Kyoshi, grew up unfound, unclaimed, and untrained. Abandoned by her parents, working as a servant, living the sort of early life that the Order exists specifically to prevent, while the Order was elsewhere, congratulating itself on a job well done. The whole time, their existence was hidden from the public, so Kyoshi couldn't have gone looking for them even if she'd known to. There was nobody to be let down by, because as far as she knew, there was nobody there at all. I find this genuinely hard to get past, and I've thought about it a lot, because everything we've established about this organisation, the reach, the assets, the members embedded in temples, the free soup, the couriers, the centuries of accumulated method, all of that is machinery built for one purpose. And the one time it really properly counts, the machine produces the wrong answer, and nobody catches it for years. They didn't fail to find her because they weren't looking. They failed because they were sure, which, if you want a thesis for this whole video, might be it. The White Lotus is at its worst when it's confident. I think it's worth sitting with what that actually costs, rather than treating it as a plot beat. An avatar who's found early gets everything. They get teachers lined up before they can walk. They get a mentor who explains what the voice in their head is. They get, above all, an explanation, someone who turns up and says, "This thing that is happening to you is not madness, it is a job, and here is how the job works." Kyoshi got none of that. She got a childhood of being nobody, in a world where the correct answer to who she was did not exist. On paper, in an organisation that had the resources to reach her, and simply didn't. And by the time anyone worked it out, the shape of her was already set. You cannot unhave a childhood. I'm not saying the Order made Kyoshi who she was. That's too neat, and it's also a bit insulting to her. But I'd say this much. The Avatar, with the most famously uncompromising view of justice in the whole cycle, is the one who grew up with none of it, and I don't think that's nothing. Now what happens afterwards is where it gets a bit painful and a bit funny, and honestly, a bit sad. Because when Kyoshi's identity finally comes out, the Order does not turn up. There's no delegation, no apology, no committee. What there is a bloke called Jinpa. Jinpa is an air nomad and a member of the Order, and he goes to Kiyoshi and he apologises, indirectly, on his organisation's behalf, for a catastrophic failure that shaped her entire childhood. And he starts hinting that there's an organisation behind him. And Kiyoshi doesn't understand him. Because why would she? She's had no education, no context, and no reason to think a stranger being oddly apologetic is anything other than a stranger being odd. She dismisses him. So the great reveal of the Order of the White Lotus to Avatar Kiyoshi is a man being vague at her until she wanders off. It gets better. Over the following year, Jinpa gets himself appointed as her secretary. And he spends his time trying to help her become a good avatar and repeatedly hinting at the White Lotus's existence and never once fully revealing the organisation. He's her secretary. He's in the room every day. He has presumably hundreds of opportunities. And he keeps doing the thing where he gestures at the shape of the truth and hopes she'll fill it in herself. I don't know. I really don't. There's a version of Jinpa that's deeply admirable, a man who understood the debt his order owed and quietly paid it off, personally, with his life's labour, without ever asking for credit. That's genuinely lovely. That's a good man. There's a version where he's just a bit of a coward about the actual conversation, and I think both versions are true at once, and I think that's why he works as a character. Here's the thing that gets me though. For a secret society, an enormous amount of their trouble comes from being secret. That's not a paradox, it's just a cost, and I don't think they ever properly accounted for it. Every problem in this section is a secrecy problem. They couldn't ask openly, so they had to guess. They guessed wrong. They couldn't admit they'd guessed wrong, so they sent one man to hint. The hint didn't land, because hints don't. And so the whole apology, the whole institutional reckoning with the worst mistake in their history, gets compressed down into a man saying something slightly strange to a young woman who then gets on with her day. You cannot run an accountability process through a pie show board. The deeper thing underneath it is that there was nothing to hold them to. That's what secrecy actually buys you, and I don't think they'd ever priced it. If nobody knows you exist, nobody can be angry with you. Nobody can demand a review. There's no press, no inquiry, no furious letter, no meeting where somebody has to stand up and say the words, "We got this catastrophically wrong," which sounds like freedom and is actually rot. Because the only thing keeping the Order honest was the Order, and the Order thought it was doing brilliantly. Sort of like how our parents talk about how hard it was back in the day whenever we'd complain about something growing up. There's no arbiter. There's just the story the older party tells itself, and everyone nodding. Now let's talk about what the Order actually does day to day, because I've been describing the philosophy and the failures and not much of the plumbing, and the plumbing is quite good. There's a courier called Opalajuk. Her normal work is carrying messages between the northern and southern water tribes, which is a long way and a genuinely hard job. The sort of thing where you're one bad storm from not arriving, and the Order hires her in the case of deliveries of extreme importance. Not always, only when it matters. That's tradecraft. She isn't a member, she's a professional who exists in the world doing an ordinary job for ordinary people, and every so often somebody quietly pays over the odds for a run. Which means she doesn't know anything, so she can't tell anyone anything, and there's no pattern to her movements, because her movements are just her job. If you were watching her for a year, you'd learn nothing except that a woman carries letters between two poles. That's better than half the spy networks I can think of. Then there's Myung-soo, who's a member, and whose one appearance in the record is a corker. During the 100-Year War, before Aang was even out of the ice mind, so the world has no avatar and no reason for hope, Myung-soo takes a group of adventurers and tasks them with a job: infiltrate the Fire Army. As spies and saboteurs, slow the advance. The target isn't a fortress or a capital, it's a remote, defenseless village called Jayin. That's the Order. That's the whole thing in one job order. Nobody's coming to save Jia Yin. Jia Yin is not strategically important. Jia Yin will not appear in anyone's history of the war, and a member of the White Lotus quietly arranges for some very brave people to go and get inside an army to buy that village time. No credit, no banner, no record, except a line in a book decades later. I said earlier that the Order is at its worst when it's confident. I'd add the other half now. It's at its best when it's small. Myong-su and a handful of adventurers and one village. Ayunerak and a pot of stew. Aupelajuk and a letter that mattered. Jinpa and a job as somebody's secretary. That's when this organisation is genuinely wonderful, when it's one person deciding to be useful, quietly, without asking permission. It's when they act as an institution that they get it wrong. When there's a delegation and a process and a consensus, and everyone's terribly sure. That's how you miss an avatar. I want to flag something about all of this because I've been leaning heavily on material that isn't in the shows. Kiyoshi's whole business is from the novels. Jinpa's a novel character. Myong-su and Aupelajuk are from the Avatar Legends role-playing game, which is a lovely book and absolutely stuffed with this stuff. The Yang Chen material we did earlier, same deal. So if you've only watched the cartoons and you're lying there thinking you'd have remembered a bloke called Jinpa, you wouldn't. He's not in them, which is worth knowing because it changes how you read the Order in the shows. When Iroh sits down at that pie show table, the show gives you a fun secret handshake and a bit of intrigue. But behind him there's a few millennia of couriers and stew, and one enormous, unforgivable mistake, and the show never mentions any of it. You just have to take the tile at face value. Anyway, speaking of Iroh, the thing you have to hold in your head about Iroh is that before he was the T-Man, he was the siege. Iroh laid siege to Ba Sing Se for 600 days. He broke the outer wall, which nobody had ever done, and he was so effective at it that he was called the Dragon of the West, and he earned it. That's the man. Not a kindly uncle who wandered into the war by accident. A general who was extremely good at the worst possible job. And then Lu Ten died, his son, at the siege, and Iroh stopped. He didn't lose. That's the part people forget. He was winning, and his son died, and he put the whole thing down and walked away, and Ba Sing Se stayed standing for another 60-odd years because a man's heart broke. What he did next is where we come in. He went on a spiritual journey, and somewhere in the middle of it, he joined the Order of the White Lotus. I want to be careful here because this is one of those details that lives in the show, as well as in the role-playing game core book, and it's a single line. But it's a single line that reorganizes the character completely. Iroh doesn't find the White Lotus at the peak of his powers, or as a young genius, or as a decorated hero being tapped on the shoulder. He finds them at the bottom. He finds them as a man who has just discovered that the thing he was best at in the world was not worth what it cost him, and they take him in. Within a few years he's a Grand Lotus, which is fast, extremely fast, for an organisation this old and this careful, and I think that tells you something about both parties. It tells you Iroh was obviously remarkable, and it tells you the White Lotus was not remotely precious about seniority. They looked at a broken Fire Nation general who'd spent 2 decades trying to destroy the Earth Kingdom, and they said, "Right, you're one of the people in charge now." That is either the most enlightened recruitment policy ever devised, or an enormous risk taken on vibes. Possibly both. So what is a Grand Lotus, actually? Here's what we know, and it's less than you'd think. Paku uses the title for Iroh, and the specific power attached to it is that a Grand Lotus can call the Order together. That's the authority, not command, convene. Which is a fascinating way to build a leadership rank. It's not the Grand Lotus decides, it's the Grand Lotus can put the question to the room. He's a man with a whistle, not a crown. The phrasing Paku uses, has a small ambiguity in it that fans have been chewing on for years, because he says a Grand Lotus, not the Grand Lotus, which raises the very real possibility that there's more than one at any given time. Multiple people with whistles scattered across the world, any of whom could pull the emergency handle if they thought the moment warranted it. Nobody's confirmed that. It might just be how the man talks, but I've always liked the idea because it fits everything else about them. A network with several possible triggers and no single point of failure is exactly the sort of thing this lot would build and then never explain to anybody. There's a second title on him, incidentally, that gets lost in the shuffle. Iroh wasn't just a Grand Lotus, he was a Grand Master at Pai Sho. Actually, genuinely, the best in the world at the board game, which recontextualizes the Pier scene one more time. He isn't buying a spare ID card, he's a Grand Master replacing a piece of his kit. Both things are true at once, and the man is enjoying every second of it. Now, before we get to the famous members, I want to give a moment to the least famous one, because I think he's the most representative. Foong. That's the man in the desert. He runs into Iroh and Zuko while they're being hunted, and he plays the Lotus and Iroh answers, and that's that. Foong never does anything impressive. He doesn't bend, he doesn't fight, he isn't a master of anything we ever see. What he does is help Iroh and Zuko slip a set of bounty hunters and then hand them the passports that get them into Ba Sing Se. That's it. That's his whole contribution to world history. Some paperwork and a bit of local knowledge, and it's decisive. Zuko's entire arc, the tea shop, the crossroads, the turn, all of it, roots through a bloke with a stack of forged documents who recognised a tile. That's what the Order mostly is. It isn't the 5 old masters at the campsite. It's Foong. It's hundreds of Foongs in every town being unremarkable, waiting for someone to sit down opposite them and play a flower. Now let's talk about Piandao, because Piandao is my favourite member, and I think he's a bit underrated. Piandao is Fire Nation, born to firebenders, and he didn't inherit it. No bending at all. So they left him at an orphanage. That's it. That's the whole reason. Your parents can throw fire, and you can't. So you're somebody else's problem now, which, given everything the Fire Nation was in that era, is bleakly on brand. And it's the kind of casual cruelty the show tends to drop in a single sentence and move past. Instead of getting bitter about it, Piandao found painting and calligraphy. He got into the arts because they kept him calm, which is a remarkable thing for a discarded child to work out on his own. Then somebody spotted his natural talent for swordsmanship at a Fire Nation boys' camp, and off he went. So the man becomes one of the greatest swordsmen alive, Fire Nation's finest, and he is, quietly, a member of an international society that opposes everything his nation is doing. Then Sokka turns up. Sokka, who lies about his identity to get lessons. Sokka, who is not a prodigy at anything and knows it. And Piandao trains him anyway, and works out his water tribe almost immediately, and doesn't care. And at the end of it, he gives him a white lotus tile. He doesn't explain it. He just hands it over as a parting gift and lets the boy walk off with it. And Sokka, bless him, has no idea. He puts the lotus on the hilt of his sword because it looks nice. Same flower that's on the gate of Piandao's estate, which was sitting there in plain view the entire time. I love that scene more every time I think about it. Because what's actually happened is that a member of the Order has just handed the Avatar's closest friend a live membership token, unprompted, with no instructions, on the assumption that it will matter later. And it does. It matters enormously later. He didn't tell him. He never tells anyone anything. None of them do. But there's a bigger point buried in the membership list, and it's the thing the show is genuinely arguing rather than just decorating with. Look at who's in the room at Ba Sing Se. Iroh, Fire Nation royalty, former general. Jong Jong, Fire Nation, a deserter, the first man to walk out of that army and live. Pakku, Northern Water Tribe, a master. and an absolute pillar of a culture that spent a century being ground down by Iroh's people. Bumi, Earth Kingdom, a king of a city that Iroh never personally besieged. Take Jongjong on his own for a second, because he's the most quietly astonishing person in that tent. Jongjong deserted the Fire Nation army. He is the first man known to have walked out of it and survived, which in that military is not a career move. It's a death sentence that didn't land. He hated firebending, properly hated it, thought of it as a curse, taught Aang exactly one lesson, and spent most of it warning him off. And he's standing there under Sozin's comet, about to use the most powerful firebending anyone has felt in a century. Bumi's the other end of it, king of Omashu, 112 years old, and the single, most cheerfully unhinged person in the franchise. A man who let his own city fall on purpose, because he decided the timing was wrong, and then took it back single-handed when the timing improved. Iroh besieged the Earth Kingdom, capital, Ba Sing Se. Parku's tribe was at war with Iroh's nation for 100 years, and they're in the same club, and have been for ages, and it's fine. That's not a nice bit of set dressing. That's the entire argument of Avatar, The Last Airbender, in one campsite. The show has spent 3 seasons telling you that nations are not morally monolithic, that there are decent Fire Nation people, and that a flag is not a soul. And then it shows you an organisation that has been operating on that assumption since before any of the nations existed, staffed by people who worked it out ages ago and have been quietly getting on with it while everyone else burned each other's homes down. Loyalty to an idea rather than a country. That's the whole society. That's what the tile means. Every single one of them is a master. That's the other thread. Every known member before the end of the war is a master of their art, and most of them are high-ranking in their own society as well. Kings, generals, grand masters. This isn't a support group. It's the best people in the world, from every nation, sitting in a tent playing a board game and waiting. Waiting for what, though? That's the question. Because they'd been waiting a very long time. They were waiting for a comet. Here's the image I always come back to. Old men in indigo walking out of a tent. Because that's how it happens. Team Avatar is scattered and desperate and out of time, and they come across a camp, and out of it walks Iroh, and then Pakku, and then Bumi, and then Jongjong, and then Pian Dao, and they're all in the same uniform. Indigo with white detailing, a cape in the same colour, a lotus patterned mantle across the shoulders, and a flag with a white lotus flower on it, which they have apparently just been carrying around this entire time, waiting for a reason to put it on a pole. Nobody has ever seen any of this. Not Aang, not Sokka, not Katara. These are their teachers, their mentors. Between them they taught most of Team Avatar, most of what it knows. And every one of them was in the same secret society the whole time. And none of them said a word. And they've now all turned up in matching outfits, like the world's most alarming school reunion. Iroh's kit is a step above, because he's a grand lotus indigo armour, a robe underneath everything, the whole thing designed off the shape of a lotus flower. He looks incredible, no notes. The organisation had maintained a low profile for its entire existence, and then Iroh called them together, and they came. That's the whistle, by the way. That's the power we talked about. Convene. He used it exactly once that we know of, and this was it. Now, the actual liberation of Ba Sing Se is one of the great sequences in the show, and I'd like to walk through what's happening in it, because the mechanics are lovely. Sozin's comet is passing, which means firebending, all firebending, everywhere, is amplified to an absurd degree. That's the reason Ozai picked that day for the end of the world. It's the single best firebending day in a century. So Iroh and Jongjong use it. That's the move. 2 Fire Nation firebenders, using the Fire Nation's own comet, at the exact hour it was supposed to end the war, to take Ba Sing Se back off the Fire Nation. They're not fighting the comet, they're riding it. Ozai's advantage becomes their advantage on his schedule, because he was kind enough to arrange the timing. I find that so satisfying. It's not a clever trick exactly. It's just an old general noticing that the enemy has scheduled a global firebending buff and deciding to be a firebender that day. Around them, the rest of it. Paku on water, Boomy on earth, and Piandao with a sword, and no bending whatsoever on the day when bending is at its most powerful in living memory, walking into the largest city in the world and doing perfectly fine. That's such a deliberate choice by the writers. On the one day, when raw bending power is turned up to the maximum, they made sure the shot includes a bloke with a stick who was thrown away as a child for not having any. There's also a bit that gets skipped, which I want to give its moment. Before all this, the Order helped Sokka, Toph, and Suki by lending them an eelhound so they could reach Ozai's airship base. That's it. That's the contribution. They lent them a mount, and the entire airship fleet business hinges on them getting there in time. Millennia of intelligence, and one of their most consequential acts in the whole war is, here, borrow the fast animal. Anyway, Ba Sing Se falls back into Earth Kingdom hands, the war ends, Aang does his thing with Ozai, and the world starts breathing again. And then the Order makes a decision. Shortly after the war ends, the society stops concealing itself from the public eye. It comes out. It begins to serve the world, and the Avatar, openly. Some of the operations stay quiet. They don't publish everything, they're not idiots, but the fundamental posture flips. All that watching from the back of the room, over, now. I want to be fair to this decision, because it's about to cause every single problem in the back half of this video, and I think it's important to say up front that it was a good decision. Think about what they'd just been through. The Order had failed to prevent the Air Nomad genocide. They'd failed to find Aang. They'd spent 100 years while the war continued, and they had not stopped it. All that reach, all that method, all those centuries of careful, subtle influence, and the world burned anyway while they took notes. And then a 12-year-old came out of an iceberg and fixed it in about a year. So you can absolutely see the logic. Secrecy didn't work. Secrecy got a whole nation of people killed. The Avatar works, so stop hiding, back the Avatar, help him build something. That's not cowardice. That's a lesson, learned expensively and acted on. But here's the problem with it, and it's the sort of problem that only shows up years later. For its whole history, the Order's entire identity was that it belonged to nobody. That's the point of it. That's why a Fire Nation general and a Water Tribe master could sit at the same board during a war, and it wasn't treason because the Order wasn't on anyone's side, it was on Truth's side, and Truth doesn't have a flag. Loyalty to an idea, remember. The moment you come out of hiding and openly serve the Avatar and start working closely with the world's rulers, you've picked a side. You've become part of the furniture. You've got a relationship with power now. The nations know who you are, and where you are, and what you'll do, and you're going to be in rooms with them, and you're going to be useful to them. And that means somebody, somewhere in that organisation, is going to look up from the table and think, hang on, what exactly are we now? I'd like to jump forward briefly, because we can actually answer that, and the answer is a bit bleak. At the end of his life, Aang gave the Order a job. Find the next Avatar and keep them safe until their training's done. That's the last instruction. And the Order took it, obviously, because by then that's what they were for. So when Korra turned up, they did the job. There's a delegation. They chase down claim after claim in both water tribes, and every one of them is a dud. Until finally 3 of them travel south on Tonrak and Senna's invitation, and find a small girl who is unmistakably the Avatar. And then they build her a compound. The White Lotus directly oversaw her development, her training in each element at a facility in the Southern Water Tribe, walls, gates, guards. Worth being precise about the blame here, because the show is, it wasn't the Order that insisted she stay at the South Pole. That was Tenzin and Tonrak, Aang's son and Korra's dad. both terrified, both with good reason, and the order just provided the infrastructure. They built the thing. Somebody else decided how long she'd be in it, which is the shape of what they'd become, really. Not villains, contractors. And when she finally gets out and goes to Air Temple Island to learn airbending, they send sentries with her, to watch her, to act as bodyguards for a grown woman in the safest house in the city. And what do the sentries do? They sit in their quarters listening to the pro-bending on the radio. That's it. That's the mighty order of the White Lotus in the modern era. Blokes in a room with the match on. And Cora sneaks off the island twice, right past them, because they're not really watching, because there's nothing to watch, because the whole posting is a formality that everyone stopped believing in. I want to be fair to them. When it counted, they were good. When the Equalists came for Air Temple Island, those same sentries stood and fought, water, earth, and fire together. And with Lynn and the children, they beat the first wave outright. And then the second wave came, and it was over, and they knew it was over. They stayed anyway. The people on the island got out on bison and on naga, and the sentries stayed behind, outnumbered, to buy them the minutes. They were captured, and they were put in a line with the other benders, to wait for Amon to take their bending away, which he did. Cora gave it back to them afterwards. But sit with the image for a second, because it's the whole 70 years in one shot. The heirs of the people who took Basingsa, kneeling in a queue, waiting to be made ordinary. Because that's the thing about the quest for truth, above all else. Above all else is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Above nations, obviously. Above kings, sure. Above war, definitely. Above the Avatar? Nobody had ever had to answer that. It had never once come up, because they'd never openly served anyone. And now they had, and the question was suddenly live, and it turned out there were people in the order who had a very firm view about it. One of them was a philosopher called Sai Bao. We know almost nothing about Sai Bao. We don't know what he looked like. We don't know if he was a bender, or which nation he came from, or how old he was, or how he died, or whether he died. He never appears. Not in a flashback, not in a photograph, not in a single frame of animation. The most consequential man in this entire story is a name and a set of ideas. And that's your lot. What we know is his job title, and it's a good one. Political philosopher. We know what he did for a living before that, which is that he was in the White Lotus. Not on the fringes either. Zahir later calls him a great man, and Iroh, the Grand Lotus himself, ends up personally chasing him across the world. You don't get that treatment for being a nobody. So here's the moment it turns. The war ends, the order comes out of hiding, it starts working closely with Aang. And Zai Bao watches this happen and is disgusted. Not disappointed, disgusted. That's the word the record uses, because his read on it is savage, and I'm going to give it to you the way he apparently thought it, rather than the way Zahir repeats it later, because there's a difference. Zai Bao believed the ancient order had gone from being a force for global change to the lapdogs of an undisciplined youngster. An undisciplined youngster. That's Aang. That's a 12-year-old who just ended a 100-year war. And Zai Bao is later described as a disillusioned White Lotus member who founds the Red Lotus after the 100-year war. Not someone we ever actually see looking at Aang and judging him as a child, with no training in anything except bending, no political education, no philosophy, no plan. A boy who solved the last problem and is now going to be handed the next 100 years of world building because everyone's grateful. The oldest and wisest society on the planet has just voluntarily attached itself to him. Is he wrong? I've gone back and forth on this for ages, and I don't think he's wrong about the diagnosis. He's wildly wrong about everything else. We'll get there, but the diagnosis is sound. The order did make itself subordinate. It did tie a few millennia of independent judgment to one person's life. And Aang was young, and Aang did have blind spots. And about 70 years later, a bloke called Zai Bao would have had a field day with how the air nomad restoration went. The version Zahir gives Cora later is punchier and slightly cruder. After the 100-Year War, the White Lotus lost its true purpose. Its members came out of hiding and openly served the Avatar. They became nothing but glorified bodyguards who served corrupt nations. So a great man named Sai Bao broke from the White Lotus and began his own society. Glorified bodyguards. That's the line that sticks, and you can hear the decades of repetition in it. It's a slogan by the time Zahir's saying it, worn smooth by use. But Sai Bao didn't just storm off and start a rival club. He went recruiting. And the way he went recruiting is the single most interesting thing in this video. And almost nobody talks about it, because it's tucked away in the Iroh adventure guide for the role-playing game, rather than on screen. He roamed the world, seeking rebellious minds to mould. And on a small independent place called Jasmine Island, he found some, the autumn leaves. And I want to be really precise about who they are, because it matters enormously. The autumn leaves were community-minded anarchists. Their goal was to abolish their island's council of elders and devolve the crucial decisions about the island directly down to people in their places of work. So, workplace democracy, local, practical, small. That's it. That's the whole program. They're not maniacs. They're a group of neighbours who think the old blokes at the top shouldn't be deciding everything, and that the people doing the work should decide instead. Honestly, that's about the most reasonable anarchism you could design. That's a village hall meeting with a philosophy, and Sai Bao turns up. Now here's what he does, and it's genuinely chilling once you see it. He only meets a few of them, a handful. He doesn't address the group, he doesn't lead a rally, he doesn't take over. He meets a few people, and he circulates some of his written works throughout the autumn leaves, and then he leaves. That's it. He hands out reading material and goes. Teki and Isanash became disciples, not converts. Not sympathizers, disciples. There was another anarchist there though, and she's my favourite person in this story. A woman called Aputi. And Aputi met Sai Bao and came away absolutely disgusted with him. Her complaint was that he'd turned their group into extremists. And her theory, and I love her for this, was that he'd only come to the island in the first place to subvert the chance of the various factions forming a coalition. Read that carefully. She thinks he showed up specifically to stop people cooperating, which is the most damning thing anyone says about Sai Bao in the entire canon, and it's said by an anarchist. He came to an island of people trying to build something together, and he broke them into pieces on purpose, because pieces are easier to use. Aputi worked it out in real time, and nobody listened to her. Teki, one of the most dedicated disciples, ended up believing that no council whatsoever should ever be allowed to reform, because any council at all would go against their commitment to complete freedom. So, a group that wanted to replace one council with lots of small ones ends up with a faction that believes no group of people should ever be allowed to decide anything together. Ever. That's not workplace democracy. That's not a coalition of neighbours. That's a dead end wearing the same badge. That's what Sai Bao's writing does to a room. He doesn't argue people into agreement. He puts a splinter in and walks off and lets it work. And Iroh, eventually, starts hearing about it. The rumours reach him. Worrying ones. And here's the bit that makes my chest ache slightly. He doesn't send anyone. He goes himself. He and Master Piandao travel to Jasmine Island in an attempt to find Sai Bao. Two of the greatest men alive, both getting on a bit, personally getting on a boat, to have a conversation with a man about some pamphlets. Sai Bao had already left, heading for the Earth Kingdom. So Iroh and Piandao arrive and find nothing but the aftermath. And the way it's described is that they began to recognise the rhetoric of Sai Bao in protests across the island. His words in other people's mouths. The man himself, long gone. He was never on the island. That was the point of him. He's an idea that goes around and does the work while he's somewhere else. I think that's why we never see him. I used to find it frustrating, the most important man in the story and not one frame of him. Now I think it's the best decision anyone made about this character. Sai Bao isn't a person in this story. He's a pamphlet. He's a thing that gets left in a room and read after he's gone, and then argued about by people who never met him, for 70 years, until 4 of them are dead on a mountain. You can't animate that. The absence is the character. Iroh spent years after that trying to mend the schism. Years. To no avail. This is where I have to be honest about Iroh, because I adore the man, and this is his great failure. The record says that he tried to keep the White Lotus united in the face of growing tensions, but that he continued to express little understanding for Sai Bao's aversion to all forms of government. Little understanding. He couldn't get his head round it. Iroh, who understands everything, who has a proverb for every situation, who can talk a boy back from the edge of his own worst instincts, could not model what was going on inside Sai Bao's head. The one thing he couldn't do was take seriously the idea that somebody genuinely, sincerely, philosophically thought that all government of every kind, anywhere, was the problem. So he kept trying to negotiate with a man who wasn't negotiating. Sai Bao split from the White Lotus entirely and formed his own society. He called it the Red Lotus, and the Order knew. That's the thing. The Red Lotus's existence was known within the White Lotus. This wasn't some deep cover operation. It was a known splinter faction. A bunch of former colleagues who'd walked out and set up down the road. What the White Lotus did not know was that they had gone militant. That they missed completely. The group went fully underground and grew radical and started building towards something, and the most sophisticated intelligence organization in the world had it filed as a disagreement. Iroh, in particular, continued to hope for reunification. That's the sentence. He kept hoping they'd come back. He kept the door open for years for people who were by then building sleeper cells and planning to kill the Avatar. I said earlier that this lot are at their worst when they're confident. This is that. Except this time, it isn't arrogance, it's love, which is somehow worse. He wanted them back so badly that he couldn't see what they'd become. That's the single largest intelligence failure in the whole history of the White Lotus, and its cause was that a kind old man missed his friends. I'd add one more thing about the schism, which is that both sides were arguing about the same sentence, and neither of them noticed. The creed is philosophy and beauty and truth. Iroh read that as, therefore we help the person trying to make the world honest. Sai Bao read it as, therefore we answer to nobody, including him, especially him. They're both reading the founding document correctly. That's why it couldn't be mended. It wasn't a falling out over tactics or personalities or who got which chair. It was two men looking at the same words and finding two different organisations inside them, and both of them being right, and neither of them being able to prove it. Which is, I'm afraid, how most of these things actually go. Nobody's lying. That's what makes it permanent. Right, let's do the philosophy on its own, with no plot attached, because I think the Red Lotus gets described as anarchist terrorists, and then everyone moves on, and that's doing them a disservice. Not a moral disservice. They're awful. But an intellectual one. You have to go back to one. One was the first Avatar, 10,000 years ago, more or less. And the world he lived in was not the world we've been talking about. Humans and spirits shared it badly in a constant grinding mess. And at the centre of that mess were two spirits, Rava, light, and Vatu, darkness, locked in a cycle. Every 10,000 years one of them had the upper hand. One fused with Rava. That's the origin of the Avatar, a man and a spirit permanently joined. He locked Vatu inside the Tree of Time. And then, to stop the chaos for good, he closed the spirit portals and separated the two worlds. Humans here, spirits there, doors shut. He thought he was fixing it. Everyone since has agreed he fixed it. The entire subsequent history of the world is built on the assumption that one fixed it. The Red Lotus reads all of that and comes to a completely different conclusion. Their position, and Zahir and Unalak both learned this as teenagers, sitting in the same rooms, is that one didn't create balance. He destroyed it. Rava and Vatu weren't a problem to be solved. They were the actual structure of the world, and one tore one out and imprisoned the other. And then he compounded it by splitting the physical and the spiritual apart, which the Red Lotus regards not as a repair, but as the deepest wound in history. So everything since the Four Nations, the Avatar cycle, all of it, is not a world at peace. It's a world in a very long, very stable, very comfortable state of imbalance. And the fact that it feels normal is the point. That's what makes it hard to see. I'll say it. That's a real argument. That's not gibberish. Given the facts as the show presents them, it's a defensible reading. One did split the worlds. He did lock up half of a pair. Whether that's a repair or an amputation is genuinely a question. So the program follows from the diagnosis. Part of that program is to reopen the spirit portals. Let humans and spirits share the world again, properly, as one thing. Do away with the borders and the nations. Do away with the leaders. Because the nations did not exist inside one settlement. They're downstream of the split. If the split was wrong, the nations are wrong. And every king and queen and president sitting on top of one is a person maintaining a wound. Underneath all of it, the load-bearing claim, chaos is the natural order of things, not a failure state, the default. The thing you get when you stop holding the world in a shape it never asked for. Now. Their original plan for how to do this was to free Vatu from the Tree of Time. Straight to the source. Undo the imprisonment. Let the pair be a pair again, and let whatever happens happen. Later, it changed to something much narrower and much worse. Assassinate the world's leaders and end the Avatar cycle. I want to flag when it changed, because the timing is genuinely important, and it's the part people skate over. The Red Lotus's first plan for Korra was not to kill her, it was to take her, kidnap the Avatar, raise the Avatar, teach her the ways of the Red Lotus. Reverse one's decision, using the one being on the planet who could actually do it. A fully realised Avatar who agreed with them. That's not a bad plan. That's a very good plan, and it's the reason the whole thing has such an awful shape to it. They didn't want to destroy the Avatar. They wanted the Avatar on side. Not as a hostage, as a colleague. They failed. And once the White Lotus had raised her successfully, and she was grown, and she was Korra, convincing her was off the table. So they changed the goal. If she won't be the instrument, she becomes the obstacle. Capture her, force her into the Avatar state, kill her while she's in it, and the reincarnation cycle ends forever. No more Avatars. Not this one, not any. The plan got smaller, and the plan got worse, and it got worse specifically because the other lot did their job well. That's a horrible little irony, and the show doesn't underline it, which I appreciate. Now, Guru Lagima, because you can't understand Zahir without Lagima, and Lagima is one of my favourite bits of lore in the entire franchise. Lagima was an air nomad from the Northern Air Temple, and he lived somewhere around 3,829 BG, which is a long time ago, roughly 4,000 years before anything else in this video. And he was a poet. That's his job. That's what he did. He wrote poetry about things like instinct and illusion, and he wrote it so well that his work survived all of that, and a genocide, and a 100-year war. That's not a small thing. Whole civilizations have gone missing in less time than Lagima's poems have been in continuous circulation. And through his writing about illusion, he worked something out. He worked out that gravity is an expectation, that your weight is, in some sense, an attachment, that you are held to the earth by the things that tie you to it, and that if you let go of your earthly tethers, you become weightless. And then he did it. He unlocked flight. Actual flight, unassisted, no glider, no bison, and he spent the last 40 years of his life never touching the ground. 40 years, not touching the ground. A poet worked out how to fly by thinking about it hard enough, and then simply never came down. That's the sort of thing that should be the most famous event in world history, and instead, it got filed under legend. Because it's so absurd that by Korra's era, the airbenders themselves had quietly decided it was a nice story. The poem is short. Let go your earthly tether. Enter the void, empty and become wind. There's another one about wisdom that I think about more than the flying one, honestly. It asks whether wisdom is poems written on a page, or actions done in your name, or words spoken on the wind, and then answers itself. Wisdom is formless, for only the wind remains when all else is gone. That's a man who knew exactly what he was. Now. Zahir reads all this, and the specific thing that gets him is the poem about the false nature of instinct, because what Zahir takes from it is that if you build your expectations of reality out of only what you can immediately observe, you have blinded yourself to anything new. You've decided the world is the size of your own experience, which is, I have to say, an excellent thought. That's a good idea. That's the kind of thing you'd write on a card and stick on a wall, and Zahir uses it to conclude that Lagima really did fly. Not as a metaphor, not as a parable, actually flew. Because dismissing it as legend is exactly the failure of imagination the poem is warning about. He was right, obviously. That's the maddening thing. Notice what that does to a man. Zahir spent his youth being told that a story everyone dismissed was true, and then harmonic convergence handed him airbending, and then he went and checked, and the story was false. He flew. The legend was real, and everybody else was wrong, and he was the only one who'd taken it seriously. Try being humble after that. Genuinely try. I'm not sure I could. There's a scene in Book 3 where he's infiltrated Air Temple Island as a new airbender, hunting for the Avatar, and he wanders into Tenzin's study at night and finds a scroll with Lagima's poem on it. And Ikki catches him. A little girl, out of bed, telling a stranger that nobody's allowed in Dad's study, and Zahir apologises, says he couldn't sleep. And when she asks what he's reading, he tells her it's a poem by Lagima, whom he credits as the wisest airbender who ever lived. He's not performing. That's the thing that makes the scene work. He's in the middle of a covert operation to locate a woman he intends to murder, and he genuinely stops to tell a child about a 4,000-year-old poet because he loves this stuff and he cannot help himself. He'd always admired the culture, he says to Kaya a minute later, and he's telling the truth. So here's where I land on the Red Lotus, and I'll just say it plainly rather than pretending to be neutral about it. The philosophy is coherent right up until the murder. Everything up to that line holds. The reading of one is defensible. The critique of the nations follows from it. Lagima is real, and the flight is real, and the poem about instinct is genuinely wise. You can walk the whole path with them nodding. And then the conclusion is, therefore we suffocate a queen and poison a young woman in an attempt to kill her. And there's no step there. That's what gets me. There's no moment where the argument turns and delivers you to the killing. It's just bolted on the end, load-bearing, holding up nothing. All that reading, all that thinking, all that inherited poetry, and the plan is the same plan every zealot has ever had. Here's a stat I like. The Red Lotus is only the second group since the original Team Avatar to have a bending master of all 4 disciplines. The second in 70 years. That's a hard thing to assemble, and it isn't luck. You don't stumble into a waterbender, an earthbender, a firebender, and an airbender who all agree with you about the metaphysics of one's settlement. Somebody built that, deliberately, over years. But the roster's real signature isn't the 4 elements, it's the specialisation. Because nearly every known member of the Red Lotus can do something with their element that almost nobody else can do. Gassan lava bends. He turns solid rock into molten rock and back at will in combat, which is an extraordinarily rare sub-skill, and one that turns any terrain into a weapon. Pali is a combustion bender. Third Eye, she fires an explosion at you from across a valley, and there is essentially no defense except getting out of the way. Aiwei metal bends, and he's proficient in seismic sense, reading the world through vibration in the earth. Toph's technique. That's not a party trick, that's a sensory organ most people don't have. Unalak's spirit bends, which is a variation of healing that lets a waterbender act directly on spiritual energy. Barely anyone in the world can do that. And Zahir, eventually, flies, which is the one that needs an asterisk because for the first 40-odd years of his life, Zahir had no bending at all. None. Nothing. He's the leader of a team of 4 elemental masters, and he's the only one at the table who can't do anything, and nobody seems to have thought that was odd. He was a martial artist instead, and a good enough one that when the Red Lotus went for Korra in 158, with no bending whatsoever, he held his own against Zuko, against a Fire Lord. A man who'd fought Azula and lost, at the peak of a lifetime of firebending, and Zahir, a bloke with hands, did not immediately die. So the specialization thing has a hole in the middle of it, and the hole is the leader, which makes you wonder what he was recruited for, and I think the answer's obvious once you say it. They didn't need another power. They had powers. They needed someone who'd read the books. And Zahir eventually flies. So look at what that actually is. That's not a gang. That's a curated collection. Somebody in that organization was going through the world looking specifically for people at the absolute outer edge of what their element can do and recruiting them one at a time. Which makes Minghua the odd one out. And I've always found her the most interesting for exactly that reason. Minghua has no specialised sub-skill. She's a waterbender. Extraordinary, she's arguably the best pure waterbender we ever see, and she does it with no arms, using water as her arms, which is a piece of character design so good it makes me slightly angry. But it's not a technique nobody else has. It's just waterbending, done better than anyone. Here's the fun fact which explains it. She was originally conceptualized as a bloodbender. That's the plan. That fits, that's the exact power level and the exact rarity of everyone else on the team. Minghua the bloodbender slots straight into that roster. The creators decided against it, because they'd already done a bloodbending villain with Amun, and they didn't want another one. Which I think is exactly the right call, and also a bit of a shame, because it means the version we got is the one member of the Red Lotus who's just phenomenally good at the basics. And honestly, she's better for it. She's the one who doesn't need a gimmick. Now, Unalak. Unalak is Korra's uncle. That's the headline. Chief of the Northern Water Tribe, Tonrak's brother, and the man who spends the whole of Book 2 being a very particular kind of insufferable. And he was Red Lotus. He joined as a teenager, and he met Zahir when they'd both just joined, which means these two were in the same intake. Same lessons, same rooms, 2 boys learning about Rahava and Vatu, and one's great mistake from the same teachers, and one of them ends up leading the organisation, and the other ends up as a national leader with a secret. Then in 158 AG, the Red Lotus makes its move on Korra, and Unalak isn't there. He'd not come with his comrades that day. And so, when it all fell apart, he was the one man still standing outside it, and he simply washed his hands of it. Maintained his innocence, covered up his involvement, watched 3 people he'd known for 20 years go into holes in the ground and said nothing. And then he went off script entirely, because he started pursuing his own personal ambition to become the Dark Avatar, which the Red Lotus had not planned. That wasn't the program. That was Unalak deciding that the fastest route to fixing the world was for him, personally, to become a god. He's not a true believer who went too far. He's a man who found a philosophy that flattered a thing he already wanted. And then, to diffuse any suspicion against him, he did the single most audacious thing in this entire video. He helped build Pili's prison. He collaborated with Zuko, Fire Lord Zuko. The 2 of them worked together to construct a facility in the tundras of the North Pole to hold the combustion bender. A Red Lotus member helped design a Red Lotus cell, sat down with the Fire Lord, went through the specifications, worked out how you contain a woman who fires explosions from her forehead, and did a good job of it, because that prison held for 13 years. He locked up his own colleague to keep his cover, and he did it well, and he shook the Fire Lord's hand afterwards. I've got no line for that. That's just remarkable. Cold in a way the show never quite says out loud. Then there's Ai Wei. Ai Wei is Zhao Fu's truthseer. His entire function in that city is that he cannot be lied to. He reads your body, your pulse, your tells, and he knows. And Suyin Beifong trusts him completely. Because why wouldn't you? He's never wrong. He's the most trusted man in the most idealistic city in the world, and he's a plant. Which is a beautiful bit of construction, because the joke is doing two things at once. A man who detects lies for a living, whose entire life is a lie, and also the perfect Red Lotus asset, because you can't infiltrate an organisation whose lie detector is already yours. He'd been sitting in Zhao Fu for years, just waiting, being trustworthy. Of all of them, Ai Wei's the one I find genuinely sad, because look at what he had. Zhao Fu is the best place in that world. It's the one city that actually works, built by Suyin out of nothing. No monarch, no slums, artists everywhere, everyone fed. If you were designing a place that answered the Red Lotus's complaints about how nations treat people, you would build Zhao Fu. And he lived in it, for years, in a nice house, doing meaningful work, respected by everybody. He still thought it needed to come down, because it had a leader, and leaders are the problem, and it doesn't matter how good the leader is. That's not a bug in his philosophy. That's the whole load-bearing beam. A good ruler is worse than a bad one in that framework, because a good ruler makes the case for rulers. That's a man who was given the counter-argument to his entire worldview in physical form with a garden, and lived inside it for over 2 decades and never budged an inch. And then Zahir threw him into the fog of lost souls for making one mistake. We'll get to that. Suyin's part of this is the bit that hurts, mind. She didn't just employ him, she trusted him, completely, structurally, the way you trust a load-bearing wall. And when it came out, she'd been wrong about a person for years, in a city she'd built specifically so that people could be trusted. He was the proof of concept. He was the thing that made Zhao Fu work, and he was theirs the whole time. Now 158 AG, the kidnap attempt. Cora is 4, maybe 5. Her status as the new avatar has been confirmed about a year earlier, and 4 members of the Red Lotus come for her. What stops them is the single best lineup you could possibly assemble. Tonrak, her dad, Tenzin, Chief Sokka, and Fire Lord Zuko. Sokka and Zuko, in their 70s easily. Turning up to defend a toddler in the snow, 50-odd years after Ba Sing Se, because the call went out, and they came. They win. Just about. And then the White Lotus does what the White Lotus does now, which is that it builds prisons. 4 of them, scattered around the globe, each one designed around one specific person. Zahir gets a cell made entirely of metal on top of a remote mountain. Nothing to bend, nowhere to go, no earth, no water, nothing but wind he can't touch. Gahazan gets a wooden ship, because you cannot bend a boat. Minghua gets a volcanic facility with no moisture in it whatsoever. And Pali goes into an underground cell in the northern ice, courtesy of the White Lotus. That's not incarceration, that's tailoring. And for 13 years, members of the White Lotus and Lin Beifong went in and asked them questions, over a decade of interrogation, trying to determine the motive. Why the Avatar? What's the plan? Who else is out there? They got nothing. Not one answer. Not from any of them. 4 people, more than a decade, separately, under pressure, from the best interrogators in the world. I think that's the most frightening single fact about the Red Lotus. More than the lava or the explosions, these are people who could sit in a metal box on a mountain for that long and not say a word. Because they weren't holding out, they weren't waiting for a lawyer, they just believed it, all the way down. Zahir sat in that cell year after year and didn't say anything because there was nothing to negotiate. The Red Lotus wasn't a plan he had, it was the shape of his mind. That's what the White Lotus was actually looking at, in those 4 cells, all that time. They never did see it. I'm not sure they'd have known what to do about it if they had mind, but they never saw it. It starts with a bowl of rice. That's the detail I always come back to, because it's so ordinary. Every day for over a decade, White Lotus sentries walked up to a metal box on a mountaintop and brought Zahir his daily ration of rice. Same walk, same door, same man inside, sitting there, being no trouble. And then harmonic convergence happened. The planet's energy shifted, and the shift handed airbending to people who'd never had it. Non-benders all over the world woke up able to move air. Zahir was one of them, in a cell built specifically because he had no bending at all. The next morning they came with the rice and he ambushed them, and he walked out. He read it as a sign. Not luck, not physics. Proof that the path was righteous, that the world itself had looked at what he was trying to do and given him wind. Which is exactly the kind of reasoning the Lagima poem should have warned him about. And he never noticed. Then he went and got the others, and the order matters, so let's go through it. Ghassan first, held on a wooden ship, nothing to bend, floating on water he can't touch. Zahir put on a White Lotus sentry's uniform, which worked well enough to get him aboard, and while the sentries came at him, he managed to get 3 pieces of earth into Ghassan's hands. 3. That was all it took. Ghassan turned them to lava and came out through the hull. Minghua second, a volcanic facility with the moisture cooked out of it. They brought her water. That was the whole rescue. Give the best waterbender alive some water and stand back. And Zahir told Ghassan about the airbending on the way, and about what he thought it meant. Then Pali, which was the difficult one, because by now Zuko knew. He and Tonrak had gone north to reinforce her prison. So Zahir conjured a snowstorm for cover, and the 3 of them walked into it. Zahir took Korra, Ghassan took Zuko, and Minghua went past both of them, put down the chiefs Desna and Eska, waited while Pali drilled straight up through the ice from her cell, dealt with the 2 guards, and brought her up. Druk turned up, Zuko's dragon. Pali redirected the fire and answered with a combustion blast. And then it was 4 against 2, and the 2 were an old fire lord and a water tribe chief, and it went how it was going to go. Ghassan and Pili put them both down, and the Red Lotus left. A decade and more of the best prison design in the world undone in about a week. They went to Republic City after that, and holed up in an apartment block that had been overrun by spirit vines, which nobody was going to search. And Zahir shaved his head and went to Air Temple Island, calling himself Yoru, to find out where Korra was. Which is where the study scene happens, and the locket, and Ikki, and then Kaya recognised him, because he knew too much about air nomad culture, and wanted to meet the Avatar a bit too keenly, and Kaya had grown up around actual air nomads, and could hear that something was off. She attacked. He grabbed a staff, broke her ice with airbending, and went out the window on a glider he'd taken from Tenzin's office. Pali was furious with him about it, and she was right. The whole city was looking for them within the hour, so they took a truck, threatened a driver into smuggling them out, and at the bridge the road was barricaded and every vehicle was being searched, and the poor bloke wavered under questioning and got pulled out of the cab and legged it. The police opened the back of the truck. Zahir blasted them off their feet. Minghua took the wheel and they drove. 5 police cars followed. Pali blew up 3 of them. Ghassan turned a section of the road into lava, and that was the end of the pursuit. They camped in a forest outside the city while Zahir meditated, and Minghua complained that they should have grabbed an officer to interrogate, and Pili told her they'd find the avatar in time. And then Zahir opened his eyes and said, Zaofu is where Ai Wei earns his keep. The Red Lotus came in under darkness with his help, put Korra and Naga down with Shirshu spit darts, and were most of the way out when Pabu, a fire ferret, noticed and woke up Marco and Bolin. That's how it unravels. A pet. The Metal Clan boxed them in between metal plates. Gazan melted a moat to force a stalemate. Bolin hit Poli's third eye with a pebble to interrupt her combustion bending, and Lin and Suyin came down on cables and took Korra back. Zahir went for her again, and Suyin put metal shards through his glider wing. He crash-landed, made an air dome, and they left. After that came the Misty Palms Oasis, and from there, the meeting at Saibao's Grove in the spirit world, a place named after a man nobody in this story has ever met. Zahir blamed Ai Wei for Zaofu, and Ai Wei said there was no evidence left, and Zahir decided Ai Wei was the evidence and threw his soul into the fog of lost souls, which tells you what the Red Lotus does with loyal servants of decades standing. Nothing personal, just tidying. Then Korra arrived at the grove, and Zahir talked to her, told her about Saibao, about the White Lotus losing its purpose, about Unalaq engineering the first attempt on her life. All of it true, all of it a stalling tactic, because he was simultaneously telling his people in the physical world exactly which inn she was sleeping in. She got the origin story of the Red Lotus as a distraction. That's what it was for. Then Ba Sing Se. They got an audience with Earth Queen Hao Ting by dangling information about the airbenders she'd been conscripting, and Zahir offered her a trade, the airbenders' whereabouts for the Avatar. Because an Avatar imprisoned by the Earth Kingdom means a world war. She agreed. Of course she agreed. And then a Dai Li agent went past their chamber. Zahir followed him, and he overheard that the Earth Queen's ship had gone down in the desert. So the deal was off, and they went into the throne room and put down the Dai Li, and Zahir suffocated Hooting with her own air. Then he walked to the communications room and told the city she was gone, and that he was delivering Ba Sing Se back into the hands of the people. And while he said it, Gazan brought down the internal walls between the three rings. The walls that had kept Ba Sing Se sorted by class for generations. They were brought down in an afternoon, when the Fire Nation breached the internal walls between Ba Sing Se's rings. What came through the gap was not the people, it was a plundering horde. Zahir opened the palace prison and let everyone out, gave Mako and Bolin a message for Korra, and took an airship north. The Northern Air Temple went about how you'd expect. They rounded up the airbenders as leverage. Tenzin worked it out and attacked so the others could run, and then it was Zahir against Tenzin, Minghua against Kaya, Gazan against Bumi, and Pili in the air above it all. Kaya and Bumi did well, and then didn't. Knocked off a balcony, straight into Pile's line, and Kaya talked her brother into simply letting go and falling, which took them out of the blast at the last second, which is a lovely bit of thinking under pressure. Tenzin was winning against Zahir, genuinely winning, evading everything, landing everything, and then Pili hit him from above and brought him down into range of the other three, and he still wouldn't stop, and he told them they'd never get to the Avatar while he was breathing, and the three of them went at him with everything. Then Lagima's Peak. Korra offered herself for the airbenders. Zahir named the mountain, and of course it was a lie. He'd already moved everyone except Tenzin to a cave, and Minghua had made water dummies in airbender robes to sell it. Up on the peak, Korra fought him in platinum cuffs. Tonrak went off a cliff, and Lin drew Poli's attention while Suyin bent her own chest plate around her head, just as she fired. The blast went nowhere. It stayed in, and that was Pili. And in the seconds after that, with the metal benders closing in and nowhere left to go, Zahir recited the poem and stepped off the edge, because she was the tether. That was it. That was the last thing holding him to the ground, a woman. Not a philosophy. And with her gone, he was empty, and he entered the void, and he flew. First airbender to do it in about 4,000 years, and the price was the only person he loved. He picked Korra up out of the air and carried her off. The rest is quick. Mercury in her blood to force the avatar state. Korra breaking her chains anyway. Mako electrocuting Minghua through her own water arms. Gazan refusing to go back to prison and bringing the cave down on himself to take the brothers with him, and missing, and then Korra and Zahir in the sky, and her poisoned, and him not, and it going the way it was always going to go, until Jinora put every freed airbender in a circle, and they made a tornado underneath the two of them and dragged him down. The Beifongs put him in an earth shell. Suyin bent the mercury out of Korra's blood, because Jinora worked out it was metal. Here's a small thing I noticed late and can't unsee. They died in reverse order of their rescue. Pali was freed last and went first, then Minghua, then Gazan, who came out of the wooden ship first of all, and died with Minghua in the cave, perfectly backwards, like the whole week ran in rewind and put everything back where it found it. Except of course it didn't. Ba Sing Se stayed broken. That's 171 AG, more or less. There's more of it than that, obviously, because there always is, but that's the shape of the year. Now let's talk about the real one, because the White Lotus is not made up, not the name anyway. There was an actual White Lotus Society in Imperial China, written Bai Lianjiao, romanized roughly as Bai Lianjiao, and it ran for something like 600 years, and it's one of the more remarkable things in Chinese history. It starts as religion. The roots go back to the Pure Land school of Buddhism, founded by a monk called Huyuan in the 4th century, on Mount Lu in Jiangxi province. He taught from a temple he'd built himself, and by the time of the Northern Song, so somewhere between the 10th and 12th centuries, his teachings had spread across the whole south of China. Buddhist at the core, some Taoism mixed in, a fair bit of local folk practice on top, and a prophecy running through the middle of it about the imminent arrival of the Buddha Maitreya, the one who's coming. That's it. That's a religious movement. Slightly millenarian, quite popular, nothing sinister, and then the Mongols turned up. Late 13th century, Yuan dynasty, China under foreign rule, and there were small popular demonstrations against it, and the White Lotus turned up at some of them. So the Mongols looked at this movement, decided it was heterodox, which is the technical term for we don't like it, and banned it. That's the moment. That's the actual origin. The White Lotus became a secret society because it was made illegal. It went underground because it was pushed there. It wasn't secretive by design. It got that way by necessity. And once it was down there, it turned into something else entirely. Part religion, part resistance movement, part underground network, which if you've been paying attention for the last hour or so, might sound a bit familiar. Now here's the bit I've been saving all night, and it's the reason this section exists. In 1351, a revolution took shape, inspired by the White Lotus. It's called the Red Turban Rebellion. The real White Lotus led the Red Rebellion. I want to just leave that there for a second. It worked. That's the mad part. A former boy beggar turned Buddhist monk called Zhu Yuanzhang threw off his robes and joined the rebels, and he was clever enough to rise to the head of an army, and he won people over by forbidding his soldiers to pillage, a strict policy that helped him gain popular support, which is a genuinely extraordinary military strategy. Be the army that doesn't rob you. Meanwhile, the Mongols were busy fighting each other, which never helps, and it took more than 30 years, and Confucian scholars performed the rituals and made the pronouncements about the mandate of heaven, and by 1368, Zhu Yuanzhang had the lot. He took the title Honghu. He founded the Ming dynasty. The beggar became the emperor. That's not a legend, that happened. And then it splinters, which is a word we've used a lot tonight, Because the White Lotus doesn't stay one thing. It becomes a whole family tree. There's a decent argument that it's one of the ancestors of the Chinese criminal organizations, the Triads, which came out of the Society of Heaven and Earth. And the Society of Heaven and Earth had 5 founders, called the 5 Ancestors, and they were associated with lodges named for colours: black, red, white, yellow, and green. The White Lotus may well have been one of them. Red and white as 2 branches of the same body. Somebody at Nickelodeon has definitely read this. What happened to some of those lodges is the grimmest part. Once the fighting was over, once the dynasty had turned and their use on the battlefield had ended, some of those leaders turned to crime. That's it. That's the ending. A resistance movement wins, becomes surplus, and the men who were heroes on Tuesday are running rackets by Friday because nobody told them what to do next. There's also a whole cluster of religious groups grouped under the name Tian, roughly, the way to the primordial heaven, whose origins go back to the White Lotus, labelled heretical, banned repeatedly for centuries. And they survived anyway. They kept going. You cannot legislate a lotus out of a pond. It doesn't stop there. There was a smaller rising in 1774 before the main event, led by a man called Wang Lun in Shandong, a martial arts and herbal healing expert, which is a combination of skills I'd very much like a video about on its own. And there's a derivative sect called the 8 Trigrams that came out of the same soil around the same time, doing underground meditation. Then 400 years after the Ming, in 1794, the White Lotus were at it properly again, a rising that started as a tax protest among impoverished settlers in the mountains between Sichuan, Hubei, and Shanxi. The Qing sent inadequate forces, and it grew, and it took until 1804 to put down. 8 years, something like 100,000 rebels dead, and the cost to the treasury was around 200 million taels, which was roughly 4 times the state's annual revenue. 4 times, in one war against peasants. The Qing never really recovered. The rebellion exposed exactly how weak the government was, and drained the money, and forced them to rely on Han Chinese recruits, because there simply weren't enough Manchu. It's one of the hinges where the dynasty starts genuinely coming apart. They were so rattled by it that a clause stayed in the Great Qing Legal Code until 1912. 1912, the last year of the dynasty, naming the White Lotus specifically, along with a few related groups, and prescribing sentences for people who gather at night and disperse by day and stir the people up under the pretext of cultivating virtue. They wrote them into the criminal code by name and left them there for a century. So take all that back to the show for a second. The real White Lotus is a banned underground movement that toppled one dynasty and broke another. Rebels, insurgents, the people the criminal code is written about. The Avatar version is a society of kings and generals who quietly help the establishment and end up guarding prisons. Somebody at Nickelodeon knew exactly what they were doing. That's not an accident. The name is a joke with a very long fuse on it, and it doesn't go off until you notice that the real White Lotus behaved a great deal more like Zai Bao than like Iroh. Right? Some smaller things, because there's a lot packed into this. The structure of the order mimics the Freemasons, another supposedly ancient society of secrets, with members from wildly different cultures and views scattered across the world, communicating by signs. That's the organizational model, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. The flower itself. In Hinduism, the White Lotus means beauty and non-attachment, which lands on both of the order's virtues at once. Beauty is literally in their creed, and non-attachment is why they belong to no nation. And there's the other bit of lotus symbolism, which is that the thing blooms out of murk, algae-filled ponds, something clean coming up out of something filthy, which for a group of wise people operating during a century-long war It's about as on the nose as you can get without a caption. And then the one that made me laugh out loud when I first read it. The Order of the White Lotus, OWL Owl, which in Western symbolism is the wisdom bird. That's it. That's the deepest lore in the franchise. The wisest people in the world. And their initials spell owl. I don't know if that's deliberate. I've decided it is. There's one more, and it's the neatest bit of design in the whole thing. The colours. The White Lotus is blue and white. Rava is blue and white. The Red Lotus is red and black. Vaatu is red and black. The two orders are wearing the two spirits. The people who serve the avatar dressed as the spirit inside the avatar, and the people who want to free Vaatu dressed as Vaatu. Nobody says it. It's never mentioned. It's just there on the flags from the first frame the Red Lotus insignia appears. Both of them have attacked Ba Sing Se, which is the tidiest way of putting the difference. The White Lotus went in to free the city from an occupying power and hand it back. The Red Lotus went in to kill the Queen and break the walls and throw the world into disarray. Same city, same gate, more or less. Opposite reasons. Now the ironies because the writers gave nearly every Red Lotus member an ending made out of their own philosophy, and I've never been able to decide whether it's heavy-handed or perfect. Unalaq, who wanted to become the Dark Avatar, was destroyed by Korra's spirit bending. Pali, who fired explosions across valleys, blew her own head up. Minghua, who used water as arms, was electrocuted through them. Gazan, who could turn any ceiling into a weapon, was crushed by a cave-in he made himself. And Zahir, who believed in freedom through chaos, who preached letting go of your earthly tether, who had just achieved the most untethered state any human has managed since Legima, was beaten by a group of airbenders working together and then literally tethered to the earth. Together. That's the word doing the work. The man who thought nothing should ever be organised was brought down by organisation, every one of them killed by the exact thing they'd made themselves into. It's not subtle. Then again, neither were they, so I've never really minded it. Here's how it actually ends, which is not how anybody wanted. Zahir killed the Earth Queen and told a city it was free. And what grew in the space where she'd been was Kuvira and the Earth Empire, and a genuine dictatorship with an army, and a doctrine, and a very large spirit cannon. He set out to make rulers impossible, and he made one. He is personally responsible for the most authoritarian thing that happens in the entire franchise. And he knew it. That's what I keep turning over. Korra came to see him in his new cell, underground this time, because you can't have him near open sky, and told him she wasn't afraid, and he lunged at her and laughed because she was. She tried to leave, and then she said what Kuvira had become, and he stopped. And he helped her, sat with her and worked on her, and got her back on her feet so she could go and beat the thing he'd built. Their common enemy is how it gets described, and that's about right. Restoring freedom to the Earth Kingdom. He said it like it was still his project. Meanwhile, the White Lotus got a new prisoner. Kuvira, another purpose-built box, and when she was due in Republic City for her trial, they handled the transport as well. So there it is. The society that spent its entire existence belonging to nobody is now doing prisoner transport for a government. Saibao walked out because they'd become bodyguards, and 70 years later, they're prison guards, which is worse and is also, awkwardly, exactly what he predicted. He was wrong about everything except the direction, and Iroh never fixed it. That's the bit that stays with me. He tried for years. He kept the door open for people who were building sleeper cells, because he couldn't stop hoping they'd walk back through it. As far as we know, he died with the schism open, still waiting. Many of them are still out there, incidentally. Nobody knows how many. The sentries and the leaders went back into hiding after Zahir, and there's no count. There never was, so the argument's still going. It was never settled, one side lost a fight, which isn't the same thing. I don't think it can be settled, really. That's what I've come round to over the course of tonight. The question underneath all of this is whether a group of people who answer to nobody are a treasure or a menace. And the honest answer is that they're whichever one you needed them to be that week. In Ba Sing Se, they were a treasure. On a mountain in the Earth Kingdom, they were a menace. Same structure, same creed, same flower. I've got a whole video planned on Zaofu, incidentally, because the more I look at that city, the more I think it's the actual answer both orders were groping for, and neither of them could see it. But that's for another night. Which brings us back to where we started, at that pier, with an old man haggling over a game piece, while his nephew has a quiet breakdown behind him. Because the tile did change. It's the same disc 1.5 inches of black, with a white flower on it. It's a game piece. It's a passport. It's the thing that got Iro into Ba Sing Se, and the thing Pian Dao slipped to a boy without explaining. And it's also the thing a philosopher looked at one day and decided had been dragged through the mud. Anyway,